As we heard, Bonhoeffer's convictions got him imprisoned and eventually executed. In those months in jail, knowing his likely fate, Bonhoeffer didn't lose faith. Rather, his faith was strengthened. Reflecting on Mark 8, verse 34, where Jesus says, "If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Bonhoeffer wrote, "When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die." Now, this might not mean actual martyrdom, although certainly it might. It means, first of all, that we must be ready to die to ourselves. In his commentary on the Beatitudes, Bonhoeffer writes, "Just as Christ is Christ only in virtue of his suffering and rejection, so is the disciple a disciple only insofar as he or she shares his Lord's suffering and rejection and crucifixion." So I have to ask, what do you think you would have done in his place? I don't know. For me, for any of us. But one thing we can be sure of is that Bonhoeffer didn't die in vain. People of faith in the decades since his death have accepted his challenge to dare to speak out against tyranny and to uphold the honor and dignity of all people, regardless of their religious affiliation, their color, their culture, or their sexuality. Bonhoeffer had written that faith only becomes faith in the act of obedience, not to any man-made law or worldly authority, but to God, whose call reaches us through the voice of our oppressed and persecuted neighbor. We can talk all we want about being believers, but we are not disciples until we act in obedience to God's call. You've got to walk the talk, not just sing Amazing Grace. You got to live it. You've got to do it. We've got to be it. Now, Bonhoeffer is famous for making the crucial distinction, as important now as it ever was, between cheap grace and costly grace. Cheap grace means grace without a price, without cost. Everything can be had for nothing. And Bonhoeffer reminds us that we are still in the fight for costly grace, which calls us to follow. It's costly because it costs an individual their life, and it is grace only because it is the only thing that will give us life. We talk about being saved and forgiven, something that we know that we can never truly repay. But I have a hunch that we are actually pretty crass if we don't try, right? When we chose to follow Jesus, we didn't think we'd actually have to follow him or anything, right? Of course, we knew that he might take us places that we might not be really, really eager to go. Costly grace affirms that you can only discover what obedience is by obeying. It's no use asking questions such as, who is my neighbor? Right from the get-go, you are the neighbor. So you have to go along and try to be obedient to God by loving others. We literally have no time to sit down and ask ourselves whether so-and-so is our neighbor or not. We must get into action and obey. We must behave like a good neighbor to all. Now, reflecting on Bonhoeffer's writings on the 75th anniversary of his death, Canadian journalist Sam Ben Meyer wrote this at the height of the Black Lives Matter marches last June. He wrote this: "At times like this, we see the difference between those who are satisfied with cheap grace and those who know that true grace comes at a price. And that price is obedience to the call of God, which we may hear as the choking, gasping cries of our neighbor, as the desperate pleas of the man who was down on the ground with an oppressor's knee on his neck. We must obey God's call to act." Bonhoeffer's life holds an important lesson for us today, regardless of our religious affiliation or lack thereof, Ben Meyer writes. You can put it as simply as this: you are called upon, you are called on behalf of your neighbor. When you are called to be responsible, that's not an obligation which you can decline or discharge or quit yourself of. It's an infinite responsibility, a forever commitment. And we all must be prepared to make any sacrifices necessary when we are so called. Would any of us have had the courage and the conviction to take such daring measures as Bonhoeffer did? Could we be certain that we would act even today if it cost us dearly? When faced with death, would you or I dare to act, dare to stand firm in our faith? I could only hope to be so brave and so committed to my Lord and also to my neighbor that it would not greatly matter to me if I lived or died. May I grow into a maturity of faith like that, a faith that does not count the cost of discipleship too high to pay. Amen.